Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking on a challenge. A topic so profound, it really changes how we think about the world we share with other creatures.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is. We're talking about the science that's trying to answer that age-old question. What is it actually like to be an animal?
A question that's fascinated people forever, but now we have the tools to start chipping away at it.
Exactly. And this comparative psychology, cognitive ethology, it's just exploding right now. You see headlines every day, right? Octopuses using tools, crows that seem to understand physics. I even saw one about bees doing simple math.
It feels like a gold rush of data. There's so much coming out so fast.
It is a gold rush. But what's so fascinating for our purposes today isn't the findings themselves. It's the infrastructure behind them, the very rules of evidence that let a scientist claim any of those findings are true.
Right. How do we know what we think we know?
That's the question. And our sources for this deep dive are centered on a really foundational document, 7 Challenges for the Science of Animal Minds, which was just published by Mike Dacey.
And it's important to frame this correctly. This document isn't a criticism meant to slow the science down.
No, not at all.
It's more of a systematic assessment. It basically says, look, if this field is going to survive its own success and make real, reliable progress, it has to face these 7 intrinsic hurdles, these problems that are just baked into the subject matter.
Baked in. I like that. They aren't flaws in one specific experiment, but hurdles you have to clear every single time you try to look inside a non-human mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads us directly to the core metaphor that's going to tie all 7 of these challenges together for you today, and that is the black box.
The black box. It's a classic idea, but it's never been more relevant.
So think about it like this. We can't directly see what's happening inside an animal's mind. We can't see its consciousness or its cognitive processes. The mind is, for all intents and purposes, a sealed black box.
All we can ever observe are the inputs and the outputs.
Exactly. The inputs are the things we control. The stimuli we show the animal, the training, the tasks we set up, and the outputs are the only things we can measure, the animal's observable behavior.
And every single one of these 7 challenges we're going to talk about stems from that fundamental uncertainty, that gap between the output we see and the machinery we're trying to infer, the machinery operating inside that box.
Right. The inference is the whole game.
It's the whole game. And that uncertainty is why the author argues that we have to move toward a more holistic approach. They call it inference to the best explanation.
And that requires a baseline of what they call modesty.
A whole lot of modesty. Modesty about how much we can really learn from any single isolated experiment. We have to get away from this hunt for the one single breakthrough piece of evidence that's going to solve everything.
Okay, so let's lay out the roadmap for everyone listening. We've structured this around 3 major themes today, and we're going to move from the more abstract problems down to the really nitty-gritty ones.
That was good.
First, we're going to tackle the interpretation problem. This is all about why our data is often not enough on its own, and how our own human biases can, well, contaminate the results before we even start analyzing them.
Then we'll move to the model problem. This is about the artificial boxes we put our theories in, and the huge difficulty of connecting a finding in a sterile lab back to the animal's brain and its evolutionary history.
And finally, we'll get to the experiment problem. This covers the artificiality of the lab, the classic issue of tiny sample sizes, and then the ultimate mystery, trying to measure consciousness itself.
And I think it's worth saying, understanding these challenges isn't just some academic exercise.
No, it's key.
It's the key to actually parsing the science you read about. If you understand these methodological hurdles, you understand why the experts themselves can look at the exact same data and come to fundamentally different conclusions.
Okay, let's dive in. Segment 1, the interpretation problem. And we're starting with a big one. Challenge number 1, the logical problem of underdetermination.
This is a deep philosophical problem, but it hits comparative psychology harder than almost any other science.
So what does underdetermination mean in simple terms?
At its heart, it just means that the data you collect is never enough. It's always insufficient. For any given experiment, you can almost always find multiple competing hypotheses that can perfectly predict or explain the outcome.
So the animal succeeds at the task, that's the data. But the reason it succeeded, that's where the ambiguity comes in.
Exactly. The inference we make about what's happening inside that black box, the mechanism we propose, is inherently uncertain because another totally different mechanism could have produced the exact same result.
Right. If I set up some complex puzzle for a chimp and the chimp solves it, the fact is that it succeeded. But the why is the mystery. Was it abstract reasoning about physics, or was it just, trial and error and it memorized the path?
And the classic decades-long debate that just perfectly illustrates this problem, this inability of data to break the tie, is the chimpanzee mind-reading debate.
This is the big one.
This is the big one. The core question is whether chimpanzees, like us, attribute unobservable mental states, beliefs, intentions, desires, to other individuals. Do they have a theory of mind?
The early findings on this, back in the late 70s with Premack and Woodruff, must have been just incredibly exciting.
Oh, absolutely. The setup was so clever, they'd show a chimp these short video clips of a human experimenter who was struggling with a problem.
Like what?
So maybe the person is trying to reach a banana that's hanging from the ceiling just out of reach. Or they're shivering because a heater is broken. Simple, goal-oriented problems.
Okay.
Then, after watching the video, the chimp was shown a set of photographs and had to pick one. One of the photos showed the solution to the problem, like a picture of a chair they could stand on to get the banana, or a lit heater.
And the chimps did. Surprisingly well.
They did remarkably well, a very high percentage of the time. They chose the photo that represented the correct, goal-oriented solution for the human. And the immediate interpretation was, wow, the chimp must be understanding the human's intention, their goal. They're attributing a mental state, like desire for the banana.
But this is exactly where the logical problem of underdetermination comes crashing in.
Right here.
Because we have to detail the two competing hypotheses. They both sound plausible, and they both predict the exact same successful behavior. The chimp picks the right photo.
So first you have the mind-reading hypothesis. This is the rich cognitive claim. It says the chimpanzee is succeeding because it's attributing an unobservable mental state to the human. It understands things like seeing or knowing or wanting. It grasps the difference between someone who knows where the food is and someone who doesn't.
That's the sexy, headline-grabbing explanation.
It is, but then you have the alternative, the behavior reading hypothesis, and this is the simpler, more parsimonious claim.
What does that one say?
It says the chimpanzee isn't attributing any mental states at all. It's succeeding by tracking purely observable physical features. It's learned simple rules like pick the person who has a direct line of gaze to the food, or pick the person whose body is oriented toward the correct container.
Ah. And that's the problem. Because in the real world, the physical cue of body orientation almost perfectly correlates with the mental state of knowing.
It's the physical manifestation of it. So if the experiment is just pick the person who knows where the food is, and the chimp successfully picks the person looking at the food, well, both hypotheses predict that success.
The data itself can't distinguish between the two. The logical problem is that these visible cues are often the exact same cues that would allow an animal to succeed without needing to attribute a single mental state.
And this endless ambiguity is so frustrating for researchers that it leads them to adopt a couple of, let's call them problematic assumptions. And these just make the whole challenge worse.
Okay, so assumption number one is what the paper calls the default framing.
Yes. So because of the history of the field, the dominance of what's called null hypothesis significance testing, where you always start by assuming no effect, and the traditional interpretation of a principle called Morgan's canon.
Can you just quickly define Morgan's canon for us?
Of course. It's a guiding principle that says we should always prefer the simplest psychological explanation for a behavior. Don't attribute a complex cognitive process if a simpler one will do.
So behavior reading is simpler than mind reading.
Exactly. And because of that, the simpler hypothesis behavior reading becomes the default. It's treated as the null hypothesis that you have to experimentally disprove.
So the burden of proof is always on the more complex cognitive claim.
Always. And the evidential bar gets set impossibly high. You have to design this perfect experiment that rules out any possible behavior reading explanation. But every time researchers do that, a clever skeptic just comes up with a slightly more complex version of the behavior reading hypothesis to explain the new results. It just drags the field back to square one over and over.
You know, it's funny. I always thought Morgan's canon was supposed to be a good thing, a check on our tendency to overinterpret.
And in principle, it is. But the way it gets applied in this default framing is what becomes the problem. It forces the second problematic assumption, which is the hunt for decisive evidence.
The search for a silver bullet experiment?
The silver bullet, the knockout blow. Researchers get into this mindset that an experiment has to provide a conclusive final answer against the simple explanation, or it provides no evidence at all. And what's the result?
You end up discounting valuable findings.
Exactly. You get all this interesting, suggestive, but non-decisive data, and it just gets thrown out because it failed to completely rule out every conceivable behavior reading alternative. And that just creates stasis.
I see it now. We're so busy looking for this single magic experiment that proves mind reading yes or no. But that perfect decisive experiment might not even be possible just given the nature of the black box itself.
It might not be. Or even if it is, the moment it's performed, someone will find a clever way to tweak the behavior reading account just enough to cover it. The goalposts just keep moving.
So the solution proposed here is to stop hunting for the single treasure chest and start drawing a map instead.
That's the perfect way to put it. The alternative is called cognitive cartography. We have to shift our goal. We're not looking for a single breakthrough. We're trying to map out the entire shape of the capacity.
So what does that look like in practice?
It means compiling and synthesizing evidence from dozens of different experiments. We need to identify not just the animal's capabilities, but also its limitations. Where does the ability break down?
So we stop asking the blunt yes or no question.
We abandon it. We move from, is it mind reading, yes or no, to a much more nuanced question. What are the specific contents of the representations inside the black box?
What can it do? What can't it do? What are the boundaries?
Exactly. Does the chimpanzee's representation of another agent include abstract components like knows or believes? Or is it a purely perceptual map of physical features like head facing forward and hand reaching? By mapping the full profile, all the successes and all the failures across all these varied contexts, we can build a much more powerful, holistic, circumstantial case for one type of representation over another.
So it's about the weight of accumulated evidence, not a single knockout punch.
Precisely.
This inherent ambiguity of underdetermination, it feels like it leads us directly into challenge number 2, which is how our own human mental machinery messes with our ability to even interpret the inputs and outputs of that black box correctly. We're talking about implicit anthropomorphic bias.
Yes. Historically, anthropomorphism, which is just our tendency to interpret non-human things as if they were human, was seen as a pretty simple error.
An error of overestimation, right? You see your dog looking a certain way and you assume it's feeling complex human-like sadness.
Exactly. And Morgan's canon was supposed to be the antidote. The cold water you throw on that kind of interpretation by forcing you to consider simpler explanations.
But the source material here argues that this traditional view is, well, dangerously simplistic.
It's way too simple, because implicit bias, like any cognitive bias we study, doesn't just work in one predictable direction.
Okay, that's the critical twist. It's not just about inflating intelligence.
It's not. The bias is this automatic, unconscious application of our human social frameworks onto non-human creatures. And its effect? Well, it's unpredictable. It's not uniformly inflationary.
Give us the famous example that illustrates this, the one with the primate grin.
Ah, yes. This is a perfect case study. So when a human sees a chimpanzee or a macaque pull its lips back and show its teeth in a wide grimace, what's our immediate gut reaction?
It's a smile. It looks like a smile. So we think happiness, friendliness, something positive.
That's our implicit cognitive frame, our stereotype kicking in.
Yeah.
But in reality, for those species, it means almost the exact opposite.
It's a signal of fear, right?
It's usually a signal of intense fear, anxiety, or submission. It's a defensive display. So if a researcher is coding behaviors and marks that down as happy, they have fundamentally misunderstood the animal's emotional state.
And crucially, they've missed the actual cognitive driver of that behavior, which is fear.
Exactly. So that's a clear error of projection caused by implicit bias. But notice what happened. It didn't inflate the perception of the chimp's intelligence. It just completely misidentified the internal state.
This suggests that the root cognitive error we make isn't just, I want to see the animal as smart. It's something more fundamental, more self-centered, a stereotype that says, all intelligence and emotion must look and feel like human intelligence and emotion.
Yeah, that's it exactly. And that core stereotype can cause errors in two critical ways. First is misunderstanding, like with the grin. But the second, and maybe more insidious one, is an error of anthropodenial.
Anthropodenial. So denying human-like qualities.
Or, more broadly, suppressing or just completely discounting forms of cognition that are not human-like.
Yeah.
If an animal solves a problem in a way that is utterly alien to how a human would approach it.
Like using scent trails in a way we can't even imagine.
Perfect example. Our implicit bias that intelligence involves vision and hands might cause a researcher to miss that solution entirely, or to write it off as just dumb, simple instinct, precisely because it doesn't fit our human template for what smart behavior looks like.
Okay, that puts us in a really tough spot because if Morgan's canon is designed specifically to prevent us from overestimating intelligence,
Hmm.
but this implicit bias can also cause us to underestimate or completely miss alien forms of intelligence, anthropodenial, then how useful is the canon, really? It feels like it's only protecting us from one side of the potential error.
You have absolutely hit on the core critique in the source material. The canon is philosophically inadequate for two main reasons. One, it makes this huge assumption that we can intuitively identify which psychological process is simpler, which is often not true at all.
Yeah.
And two, it only aims to correct for overestimation. But since we now know implicit bias can push our interpretations in multiple directions, simply having a rule that says, prefer the simpler story, doesn't guarantee accuracy, doesn't guarantee progress. It might just be reinforcing our blind spots.
So if this bias is as deeply ingrained as, say, confirmation bias or any of the other cognitive biases we know about, how on earth do we proceed? We can't just tell ourselves to stop being biased.
You can't. So you have to approach it like a scientist. We need an empirical science of anthropomorphism itself. We have to study our own tendency to attribute these states. And researchers have basically three main ways to do this.
Okay, what are they?
The first is the most straightforward, explicit reports. You just use questionnaires and surveys to ask people, including researchers themselves, to rate specific animal behaviors or traits.
Simple enough. What's the second?
Indirect reports. This is where you don't ask directly, but you analyze the language people use. For example, do scientific papers describing chimpanzee behavior consistently use mental state verbs like the chimp believed or the chimp intended?
Versus more neutral descriptive verbs.
Right, verbs like the chimp moved toward the object or the chimp selected the container. The choice of language can reveal an underlying bias.
And the third one sounds like the most powerful.
It is. These are implicit measures, things like reaction time tasks or effective priming. So you might flash an image of a chimp on a screen for a millisecond and then immediately show a human emotional word like anger or joy.
And you measure how quickly the person can process that word.
Exactly. If their reaction time is faster after seeing the chimp, it suggests a strong, automatic, unconscious association between that animal and that human concept. And that reveals the implicit bias, regardless of what that person might say on a survey.
So the goal isn't to get rid of that intuitive flash of recognition that, oh, that dog looks sad feeling. It's to measure it, to be aware of it, and then to develop conscious debiasing techniques that a researcher can apply before they make their final evaluation of a model.
That's the only way forward. As the paper says, some people argue that a bit of anthropomorphism can be good, that it sparks creative hypotheses, and maybe it can, but you have to be vigilant. The solution is empirical study of the bias and developing techniques to manage it so we can finally start to see the animal as it is, not just as a blurry, distorted reflection of ourselves.
Okay, we've established that just interpreting the outputs of the black box is filled with logical traps and human bias. Now we have to move on to the actual systems we build to explain what's happening inside that box. This is the model problem.
Right.
And challenge 3 gets to a core, almost tribal division in the field, the associative versus cognitive divide.
This is maybe the most enduring philosophical battle in all of comparative psychology. It's been raging for 100 years.
So let's break down the two camps. On one side, you have the cognitive models.
Right. These are typically articulated verbally in abstract terms. Researchers will hypothesize these complex internal reasoning processes using phrases like causal schemas or mental maps or theory of mind.
And on the other side,
You have associative models. These are often championed by more traditional behaviorists. They tend to be mathematically formalized, and they describe learning in terms of simple links forming between stimuli, responses, and outcomes, the classic example being conditioning.
and the historical pattern seems to be that the cognitive side will point to some amazing new behavior and say, aha, that requires complex reasoning.
And then the associative side immediately tries to come up with a way to explain that exact same behavior using the simplest possible input-output rules, without any need for that spooky internal reasoning.
The famous battleground for this for decades, as the paper points out, has been causal reasoning in rats.
It's a huge one. Cognitive theories would suggest that rats can actually understand the world in terms of causal sequences, that event A causes event B, and that understanding allows them to be flexible and make novel predictions.
Whereas the associative models tried to explain their success by saying the rat just learns simple links. When I see A, B usually follows. No understanding of cause, just correlation.
And for a long time, the associative side had a very powerful weapon in its arsenal, the Rescorla-Wagner model, the RW model.
Okay, this is a big one. Let's break it down. What does the RW model do?
The RW model was truly groundbreaking. It's a formal, mathematical associative model that describes how the strength of an association between a cue like a light and an outcome like food changes with each learning trial.
And the key mechanism is something called prediction error.
That's the secret sauce. The change in the strength of that association is driven entirely by how surprising the outcome is. If the food appears and the rat wasn't expecting it, that's a big prediction error, and the association gets much stronger.
But if the outcome is already perfectly predicted by other cues in the environment,
Then there's no surprise. The prediction error is zero, and the association barely changes at all.
let's use a concrete example to show why this was so powerful. The phenomenon of forward blocking.
Okay, so in a forward blocking experiment, you have two phases of training for a rat. In phase 1, you repeatedly pair a light with food. The rat learns that light predicts food. The association between light and food becomes very, very strong.
It reaches its maximum strength. The light is a perfect predictor.
It is. Now, in phase 2, you present the rat with a compound cue. You show it the light and a tone at the same time, followed by the food.
So the light is still there, perfectly predicting the food, but now there's this new thing, the tone, added in.
Exactly. Now, what does the RW model predict will happen to the tone?
Well, if learning is all about surprise, there is no surprise. The light already predicted the food was coming.
Correct. The prediction error is zero. So the RW model predicts that the tone will develop zero association with the food. The presence of the pre-trained light blocks the tone from gaining any predictive power.
And when you test it later, you show the rat the tone by itself, and it has no reaction. It doesn't expect food.
None at all. And this was a huge victory for associative models, because this phenomenon, which looked an awful lot like rational inference, the rat concluding the light already caused the food, so this new tone must be irrelevant, was perfectly accounted for by the simple mechanical mathematics of the RW model.
It seemed like the associative models could just keep expanding to swallow up anything the cognitive side threw at them, but then they hit a wall. And that wall was called backward blocking.
This is the crucial counterexample. This is where the simple models start to break down.
So walk us through the setup for backward blocking.
Okay, it's a bit of a mind bender. In phase 1, you train the rat with the compound cue right from the start. Light plus tone leads to food.
So in this case, both the light and the tone should gain some association with the food. They share the predictive credit.
Exactly. They both gain equal moderate association strength. Now here's the twist. In phase 2, you present the rat with just the light alone, followed by food, over and over.
So the association for the light is being reinforced, it's getting stronger, and the tone isn't present at all.
That's right. Now, what would the simple RW model predict about the tone? Since the tone isn't there in phase 2, its association strength shouldn't change. It should just stay at that moderate level it reached in phase 1.
That makes sense, but that's not what happens empirically.
Not at all. When you later test the rat with the tone alone, it shows a significantly suppressed reaction. It acts as if the tone was never relevant in the first place.
Yeah.
It has retroactively devalued the tone.
Wow, okay. That's really complex. The rat seems to be reasoning something like, wait a minute, in phase 2, I learned that the light by itself is enough to cause the food. So if I think back to phase 1, when I saw both the light and the tone, it must have been the light doing all the work back then too. Therefore, the tone is irrelevant.
It's a retrospective reevaluation. It requires this complex, counterintuitive comparison of past and present experiences. And the simple, trial-by-trial, prediction error mechanics of the original RW model just cannot explain it.
And this forced the associative theorists to build more and more complex models to try and account for these new findings.
They did, but the models became more and more brittle. They were just adding patches and fixes, which brings us to the real problem. The fundamental issue isn't the models themselves. It's the underlying belief that they represent two mutually exclusive kinds of processing.
That's the model problem. The assumption that an animal's brain must either be doing simple, rigid associative learning or sophisticated, flexible cognitive reasoning. It has to be one or the other.
Right. And that creates this huge artificial gap in the middle. This massive space of moderately complex cognition is just completely neglected because the dichotomy forces researchers to either oversimplify or overcomplicate their explanations. Most animal minds probably live in that middle ground.
So the way out of this trap has to involve finding a way for these two types of models to cooperate, not compete.
It has to. And the solution proposed in the paper is a shift in perspectives called the abstract description view.
What does that mean?
It means we have to start interpreting associative models more modestly. We should see them not as a full specification of the psychological mechanism, but as a highly abstract, partial description of the regularities in how an animal's representations change over time.
Okay, unpack that a little.
An associative model can tell you what sequence of states a process moves through. It can describe the temporal dynamics with mathematical precision. But a cognitive model can then come in and explain how or why the process moves through those states. It offers the underlying mechanism that drives the dynamics described by the associative model.
Ah, I see. So they're not competing theories anymore. They become different layers of explanation for the same phenomenon.
That's the key.
The associative model gives you the precise mathematical scaffolding of the timing and the strengths, and the cognitive model provides the conceptual meat, the reasoning process, that makes that scaffolding work the way it does.
And that makes them compatible. It allows for the kind of pluralism the field desperately needs. You can use an associative model to derive precise, falsifiable predictions from a vague, verbal cognitive hypothesis. It transforms the whole enterprise into something much more rigorous.
Okay, this idea of integrating different levels of explanation leads us perfectly into Challenge 4. We're moving outside the single discipline of psychology now, because a truly holistic science has to integrate evidence from everywhere, from evolutionary biology, from neuroscience, and this integration effort hits a massive snag around the concept of homology.
Cross-disciplinary inferences are absolutely essential. We've already established that because of underdetermination, no single piece of behavioral evidence is ever truly decisive on its own.
Right.
So if we find some cool cognitive capacity in a chimpanzee, we need to bring in other evidence. Is the brain circuit underlying it the same as a similar circuit in humans? Did this trait evolve once in a common ancestor or multiple times independently? That question of shared ancestry is the question of homology.
And if two traits are homologous-like, say the visual cortex in humans and chimps, it means they descended from a single trait in our common ancestor. And if that's true, then information we learn about the chimp brain can powerfully inform our theories about the human brain and vice versa.
It's an incredibly powerful inferential tool. But, and this is the big but, for psychological traits, you immediately run into the boundary problem.
The boundary problem.
How do we know the exact boundaries of a homologous trait? What's the right grain size for the comparison? When we claim trait X is homologous in species A and B, how much detail is actually included in that claim?
It must be much harder for behaviors and brain circuits than it is for, say, a specific bone in the wrist.
Infinitely harder. Bones are relatively fixed. Neural systems and behaviors are incredibly plastic and can change function over evolutionary time. And the paper gives two fantastic examples that really demonstrate this boundary problem in action.
Let's start with the first one, the neuroscience of emotion, specifically the neural circuitry for rage or anger.
So, many theories of emotion suggest that basic emotions, like anger or fear, are ancient, highly conserved, and homologous across many species. The classic work by Jack Panksepp identified what he called the rage system in cats. It's a circuit centered on parts of the brain, like the periaqueductal gray, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala.
And if you stimulate this circuit,
If you electrically stimulate that circuit in a cat, you get this explosive defensive rage. Hissing, growling, back-arching. It's a very distinct pattern, and it's different from, say, a quiet predatory attack. This rage system looks like a very strong candidate for being homologous to human anger.
okay, sounds straightforward so far, but I'm guessing it's not.
It's not, because not all species express aggression in the same way. When you look at studies of rats, researchers often identify something different. They call it an offense system.
How is that different from the cat's rage system?
The rat's offense behavior is typically very stereotyped and specific. It's a focused, side-biting attack, usually aimed at the back of a rival male. It's instrumental. It's not a generalized defensive explosion. And the neural circuitry involved, while overlapping, has some key differences from the cat's rage system.
So here's the interpretive dilemma.
Here's the boundary problem. It's entirely possible that the cat rage system and the rat offense system are not homologous to each other. They might be two different evolutionary solutions to the problem of aggression.
And if they aren't homologs of each other,
Then they can't both be direct, one-to-one homologs of the single complex thing we call anger in humans. And that creates this huge uncertainty. We can't know if findings about aggression in the rat brain tell us anything meaningful about anger in the human brain until we can resolve which system, if either, represents the true ancestral trait. The inference is unreliable.
Wow, that is a massive implication for any kind of comparative work. And if it's that hard to trace a fundamental emotion like anger, how do we possibly handle the even more complex psychological structures that are proposed in, say, evolutionary psychology?
And that brings us to the second case and the concept of the specificity trade-off. So evolutionary psychology often posits these highly specific, dedicated mental modules. The classic example is a cheater detection module that supposedly evolved to help us enforce social contracts. These are fundamentally claims about homology.
And any claim based on homology, as the paper lays out, requires two separate inferences to both hold true.
Exactly. Inference one is the homology claim itself, that this specific functional trait was present in the common ancestor and was conserved over time. Inference two is the juicy part, the claim that the specific features of that trait in the source species, like its exact computational algorithm, can tell us about the features of the trait in our target species, like humans.
Okay, so this is where it gets really paradoxical. This is the trade-off. How does the level of detail you claim hurt or help you?
Let's say you make a claim with high specificity. You propose that a very precise cheater detection algorithm is homologous between, say, humans and another primate.
Okay.
In that case, inference two, the part that tells you about human psychology, is incredibly strong and informative. You learn a lot if it's true. But what about inference one? The probability that such a specific, complex computational mechanism was conserved perfectly across millions of years of evolution is, well, it's very weak. It's just too specific. Evolution almost always tinkers and modifies things. So the claim is highly informative, but probably false.
Okay. And the flip side of the trade-off.
The flip side is you make a claim with low specificity. You just say that a very general social intelligence system is homologous between humans and chimpanzees.
Now, inference one, the homology claim, is almost certainly true. It's highly probable that our common ancestor had some form of social cognition.
Exactly. Inference one is strong. But what about inference two? The claim is almost useless. It tells you next to nothing about the specific computational processes happening inside the chimpanzee's mind. You're right back in the ambiguity of the boundary problem.
So that's the paradox. The more specific and informative your homology claim is, the less likely it is to be true. And the more probable your claim is, the less informative it becomes.
It's a nasty methodological trap.
It feels like one. So how do we get out of it? How do we escape the specificity trade-off?
The paper argues we need a bootstrapping homology approach. Instead of relying on a single claim of similarity at just one level, like just behavior, or just one neural circuit, we have to build our confidence by looking for convergence across multiple, distinct levels of analysis.
So we compare behavior and neural structure and what else?
And genetic mechanisms, sometimes you hear this called deep homology, looking at the conserved genes that build these structures, and also the developmental trajectories. How does the trait emerge over the animal's lifetime?
So if the similarity holds up across all those different levels,
Then our confidence in the homology, even a relatively specific one, gets bootstrapped. It's built up from these diverse, independent lines of evidence, and the claim becomes much more robust. We don't just assume homology. We have to earn it through this painstaking multi-level convergence of evidence.
let's turn now to the nuts and bolts of the research itself, what we're calling the experiment problem. Challenge number 5 gets right at the heart of the lab: ecological validity and the divide between the lab and the field.
This is that fundamental trade-off of any controlled environment. Lab experiments are fantastic because they give us incredible control over all the variables, which lets us collect clean data. But they almost always do so by sacrificing naturalness.
And the risk here isn't just that the findings from the lab won't generalize to the animal in the wild. That's the external validity problem. There's also a threat to internal validity.
And that's often the bigger worry. The question of internal validity is, are we actually measuring the cognitive capacity we think we're measuring? Or is the animal just using some kind of weird, context-specific trick that only works in this bizarre artificial setup we've created?
And the textbook example of this trade-off that the paper uses is the bee arithmetic experiment.
Yes, from Howard and colleagues in 2019. And this study was just fascinating. It got a ton of press because it suggested that honeybees could understand and apply the concepts of addition and subtraction.
Okay, walk us through the setup, because the artificiality here is really the key to the whole problem.
The setup is incredibly controlled. They trained individual bees to fly into a Y-shaped maze. At the entrance to the maze, the bee would first see a sample card with a number of shapes on it, say 3 blue squares. Then it would fly into the decision chamber of the Y maze. The two arms of the maze had different numbers of shapes, and the rule was determined by color. If the shapes at the entrance were blue, the bee was rewarded for choosing the arm that had one more shape. If the shapes at the entrance were yellow, it was rewarded for choosing the arm with one less shape.
So blue meant add one, and yellow meant subtract one.
Exactly. So if the bee saw 3 blue squares at the entrance, it had to fly to the arm of the maze that had 4 squares to get a sugar water reward.
The level of artificiality there is just staggering.
It really is. You have a highly unnatural setting. A Y maze, not a field of flowers. You have unnatural stimuli, these abstract shapes on a card. You have a totally unnatural response learning to associate abstract colors with numerical operations. And crucially, the training for each bee required hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individual trials.
The interpretation worry just jumps right out at you. Are the bees really doing arithmetic? Or is their little black box just solving this problem using some simpler non-numerical cue that is only present in this highly constrained artificial context?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Skeptics immediately worried that the bees might not be tracking number at all. Maybe they're tracking a lower-level visual property, like the total surface area of the shapes, or the overall brightness, or the spatial frequency, just the general density of the elements.
And that super long training period is a red flag. It feels like you're not discovering an innate capacity. You're just teaching the bee how to cope with this bizarre game you've invented.
Precisely. And the classic defense of these kinds of experiments, which comes from a psychologist named Mook, is that they are designed to show what an animal can do, not necessarily what it does do in the wild. But that defense doesn't solve the internal validity problem. We still need to know what capacity is actually being demonstrated in that sterile lab setting.
So we need a method that can respect the control that the lab provides, but also systematically connect the results back to the animal's natural, evolved capabilities.
And the proposed method to do that is to use anchoring experiments.
Anchoring experiments, what's the idea?
The idea is to stop judging single experiments as isolated successes or failures. Instead, we need to build a systematic network of studies. And you start by selecting a touchstone, an anchoring experiment that very closely mimics a natural behavior.
Like what, for a bee?
For a bee, an anchor might be studying its foraging patterns in a complex, semi-naturalistic environment, or testing its innate ability to learn the colors and shapes of real flowers, something that taps into its evolved skill set.
And then once you have that safe natural anchor, you start building the artificiality outwards from there, layer by layer.
That's it. You systematically vary one dimension at a time. You change the stimuli, you change the context, you change the required response, moving further and further away from that natural anchor.
And you see where the ability holds up and where it breaks down.
Exactly. If the capacity, say, numerical cognition, holds up across mild, medium, and eventually even extreme levels of artificiality, then we can gain real confidence that the same underlying mechanism is operating across all those contexts. But if it breaks down the moment you move away from the naturalistic setup, then you know your initial finding was probably just a context-specific trick.
That sounds like cognitive cartography, but applied to the experimental process itself. You're mapping the boundaries of the capacity by systematically varying the environment, not just the logical structure of the task.
That is a perfect analogy. And the benefit is twofold. First, it helps to validate the lab results by tracing their connection all the way back to the animal's behavior in the wild. And second, it helps you map out the limitations of the capacity. What specific conditions cause it to fail?
And the source points out that we don't even necessarily have to start from scratch. We can often look back at the existing literature, at all these scattered experiments done over decades, and reinterpret them as an unintentional network. We can identify which ones serve as the strongest, most natural anchors and build out from there.
That's right.
Challenge 6 deals with another one of those unavoidable practical realities of doing this kind of research. Sample size and generalizability. In a lot of comparative psychology studies, we're dealing with incredibly small samples, sometimes just single digits.
And sometimes, especially with great apes or elephants, animals that are expensive, long-lived, and rare in captivity, you're dealing with an N of 1, a single subject.
This practical constraint forces us to ask a really difficult methodological question. Are these small N lab results just anecdotes that take place in a laboratory setting?
It's a provocative question, and it's an interesting historical mirror. Because the entire field of comparative psychology was essentially founded by rejecting the anecdotal method of early researchers like Darwin and Romanes. They would rely on these secondhand reports from zookeepers or pet owners about heroic dogs or clever horses.
And the field replaced that with statistical rigor and controlled experiments.
Right. But now, if we have a statistically reliable finding that's based on one single exceptional animal, the line between a rigorous case study and a glorified anecdote starts to get a little blurry again.
Let's go back to the famous N1 chimpanzee case that the paper highlights, Ayumu.
Yes, the 2007 study by Ingui and Matsuzawa, this is a blockbuster. They had Ayumu, a young chimpanzee, perform a visual working memory task. Numbers would flash on a screen for a fraction of a second, and he had to recall their locations in order. And his performance was breathtaking.
He easily outperformed the human university students they tested him against.
Blew them out of the water. And the result was undeniably statistically reliable for Ayumu. It was achieved through a rigorous within-subject design with many, many trials. The data shows, without a doubt, that Ayumu can do this.
And here's the problem. How do we generalize from that? Can we make the species-level claim that chimpanzees have better working memory than humans?
It's highly uncertain. Ayumu might be an outlier, a genius of his generation, a primatological Mozart. We just don't know.
So if we can't easily generalize, we can't just dismiss these findings either. They represent a huge investment of time and resources.
We can't. So the solution requires a fundamental shift in how we interpret them. The paper argues that small sample studies should be treated less like standard experiments and more like case studies, in the way they're used in social science, or even better, like lesion studies, the way they're used in cognitive neuropsychology.
The lesion study analogy is really powerful. Explain how that works.
So in neuropsychology, you might study a human patient who has a very specific brain injury, a lesion. And let's say this patient loses the ability to do X, but they retain the ability to do Y. That single case, that N of 1, provides massive evidence against any theory that claims that process X is necessary for process Y.
It's a powerful tool for falsification.
It's an incredibly powerful tool for ruling things out. And that's how we should view these small N animal studies. They establish what an animal can do. They establish a possibility. They identify a low-frequency behavior or an upper boundary of a capacity.
So you can't generalize the average performance of the species from Ayumu's genius.
You can't. But you can use Ayumu's performance to rule out strong negative claims. For instance, if a theory claimed that a certain kind of neural structure, which we know chimpanzees lack, is absolutely necessary for high-level visual working memory, well, Ayumu's performance definitively falsifies that claim.
So their value is in establishing the boundaries of the possible, not in establishing the average reality for the species.
That's the perfect way to phrase it. These small N findings are crucial individual data points that we have to place on that holistic cognitive map we're trying to build. They identify possibilities that our broader theories must be able to account for, even if they aren't directly generalizable in a simple statistical sense. Our confidence in generalizing the result has to scale with sample size, but every single data point contributes to the overall evaluation of our theories.
And that brings us to our final segment, and to the final and perhaps the most profound challenge of all, the capstone of this entire deep dive, the distribution question.
This is the big one.
Which species on this planet are conscious and which are not? This is arguably the hardest scientific challenge there is because consciousness is private, it's subjective, and by its very nature, it seems to lack the objective third-person measures that science is built on.
Consciousness is the ultimate black box. We can't get verbal reports from most species. We don't have a consciousness meter we can just point at an animal. The whole difficulty stems from the fact that subjective experience seems to transcend the purely objective mechanical view of the world that science relies on.
And to really explore how strained our human-centric assumptions about this become, the source material focuses on the extraordinary and frankly bizarre case of the cephalopods, octopuses, and cuttlefish.
Cephalopods are so important because they are just so utterly alien to us. They're invertebrates, they're mollusks. Their evolutionary lineage diverged from the one that led to us vertebrates before the evolution of the complex brain structures, like the layered cortex that we normally associate with higher cognition and consciousness.
And yet their behavior is just off the charts sophisticated.
It's incredible. They have camouflage that's basically instantaneous. They solve context puzzles. They show evidence of play behavior. They can learn just by observing another octopus. Their complexity forces us to confront our own biases about what a mind has to look like.
So if they are conscious, it would mean that consciousness can arise from a completely different biological architecture. It would force us to abandon our human-centric models. But if we can't ask them, how do scientists even begin to try to measure the unmeasurable?
Well, as philosophers like Jonathan Birch have described, researchers tend to fall along a spectrum with two theoretical extremes when they go looking for indicators of consciousness.
Okay, what's at one end of the spectrum?
At one extreme, you have the theory-heavy approaches. The idea here is you start by adopting a sophisticated, well-confirmed theory of human consciousness.
For example,
For example, global workspace theory, which posits that consciousness is what happens when a piece of information is made globally available or broadcast to multiple different processing systems throughout the brain. Or you might adopt something like Merker's midbrain theory, which focuses on structures in the midbrain and the critical function of what's called reafference.
which is the brain's ability to tell the difference between sensory changes caused by its own actions versus changes caused by the external world.
Exactly. A crucial self-world distinction. So the theory tells you what kind of architecture, what kind of function to go looking for in the animal. But what's the major weakness of this approach when you try to apply it to an octopus?
I'm guessing it's the specificity problem.
We've got it. These theories were built based on mammals, and often very specifically on the human brain. How on earth do you generalize the required architecture or functional network to an animal that is so physically, neurologically, and developmentally different?
We don't know which specific features of the human midbrain or the human broadcasting mechanism are the essential ingredients for consciousness and which are, incidental details of human evolution.
Exactly. If we cling too tightly to the structural details of the human brain, we might be forced to conclude that the octopus isn't conscious, simply because its brain structures look different, even if it's achieving the same functional outcome through a completely alien architecture.
So the theory-heavy approach gives you high confidence in your theory, but very low confidence in its application across vast evolutionary distances. So what's on the other side of the spectrum?
On the other side, you have the theory-light approaches. These try to avoid making any strong theoretical commitments at all. They just look for simple, observable correlations between a behavior or a neural signal and human reports of consciousness.
Give me some examples.
The most powerful examples come from the study of pain. We can look for a list of behavioral indicators. Does the animal protect a damaged body part? Does it learn to avoid a place where it was harmed? And crucially, does it engage in analgesic self-administration?
So will it actively seek out and consume a pain-relieving substance if it's injured?
Right. If an octopus that's in pain will choose to spend time in a chamber where it can absorb a painkiller, that demonstrates a clear motivational goal to reduce a noxious internal state. And that strongly correlates with the felt experience of pain in humans.
Or we could look at more cognitive markers, like the paper mentions, such as rapid reversal learning.
Mhm. The theory there, a very light one, is that unconscious habitual learning is slow and hard to reverse, whereas conscious flexible learning can be changed on a dime when the rules of the game change. So if an animal can rapidly flip its learned response when a reward schedule reverses, that points towards more conscious flexible processing.
Okay, these theory-light indicators sound incredibly useful and practical. What's the downside?
The problem is that when you collect all these different disparate measures, pain protection, self-administration, reversal learning, memory retention, they often just form a mere clutter, not a coherent cluster.
A clutter, not a cluster. What's the difference?
The clutter is just a disorganized, disjunctive collection of evidence. It lacks a unifying theoretical or methodological justification that ties the pieces together. So what happens if an octopus shows a clear evidence of protecting a wound, suggesting pain consciousness, but then it completely fails a reversal learning task, suggesting unconscious processing?
We have no framework for weighing those conflicting results against each other. We're left in a messy state of ambiguity.
Exactly. The lack of a unifying justification makes the evidence epistemically unsatisfying. It's just a pile of confusing data points. And that's why the source material argues for a systematic solution that tries to bridge the gap between these two extremes.
The solution being the convergence of evidence, but organized in a very specific way. Multiple epistemic clusters.
This is the proposed path forward. Instead of demanding one single grand theory or relying on an unstructured clutter of evidence, we organize all the candidate measures into distinct, modular clusters, and each cluster is unified by its own modest, specific theoretical or methodological assumption.
Okay, give us an example of how you'd actually cluster these measures for cephalopods.
So you might establish an effective cluster. And this cluster would be unified by the simple assumption that felt emotional states are global motivating states. So the measures inside this cluster would include things like avoidance learning, analgesic self-administration, and evidence of complex motivational trade-offs, like choosing food over safety.
And then you could have a separate cluster for cognition.
Right. You could have a perceptual cognitive cluster, and its unifying assumption might be that consciousness facilitates certain types of flexible global information integration. And the measures in there would be things like observational learning, rapid reversal learning, and maybe sophisticated tooling.
Measures inside the effective cluster are all inconsistent with each other, then we know our evidence for effective consciousness in that species is weak or partial.
But when you get convergence, when a cephalopod shows sophisticated integrated behavior in the cognitive cluster, and it shows clear evidence of motivationally managing pain in the affective cluster, and maybe you find some specific neurological markers in a third cluster, then the evidence starts to become really convincing.
Because you have this collective, though still messy, convergence from multiple independently justified clusters all pointing in the same direction.
And that allows us to structure the scientific conversation. We don't have to wait for the single decisive answer to the big distribution question. We can build our confidence slowly, methodically, one cluster at a time. It makes the whole methodology robust to the failure of any single measure or any single overly ambitious theory.
So we have spent this entire deep dive wrestling with the methodological infrastructure of how we discover things about animal minds. And the underlying message really has been consistent across all 7 challenges. We have to replace the existing mutually reinforcing structure of what the paper calls standard practice.
And that old structure was built on a few key pillars. It relied on what's called success testing, a very rigid interpretation of null hypothesis testing, an exaggerated and often misused version of Morgan's canon, and that strict artificial divide between associative and cognitive models.
And the systemic replacement that's being proposed requires a fundamental shift in both attitude and method. And that attitude really is modesty.
Yes, modesty about the inferential power of any single experiment. Modesty about the epistemic weight we place on any single claim of parsimony. And modesty in how we interpret our models, seeing them as partial, abstract descriptions of reality, not mutually exclusive, competing explanations.
And the practical result of that shift in attitude is this whole set of systematic, holistic strategies we've discussed. We shift from demanding that one knockout piece of evidence to the patient work of cognitive cartography, mapping the whole shape of a capacity.
We address the challenge of integrating different fields through bootstrapping homology across multiple levels of analysis. We bridge that gap between the lab and the field by using systematic networks of anchoring experiments.
And we deal with the most difficult case of all, consciousness, by carefully organizing our messy evidence into multiple epistemic clusters.
And that systemic change is so vital because those 4 features of the old standard practice fit together so perfectly that you can't just remove one of them and expect the problem to be solved. If you just get rid of Morgan's canon, for example, the way that success testing assigns the statistical null hypothesis will still recreate that same preference for simpler processes. You just end up with a de facto Morgan's canon anyway.
You have to replace the whole system.
Only a comprehensive, systematic replacement can really move the field forward.
And the reason why all this complex, detailed, sometimes philosophical methodology matters so much isn't just for scientific rigor, although that's obviously crucial. It connects directly to the profound moral and ethical questions that we as a species are facing.
Absolutely.
We may never truly know what it is like to be an octopus or what it is like to be a bat. But by refining our science, by gaining just a little more confidence in the claims we make, we gain much needed clarity on those critical, smaller questions about animal experience, especially their capacity to feel pain, their capacity to suffer, and their capacity to have a motivational stake in their own lives.
And that shift in focus, I think, from the abstract and the mechanical to the experiential, that's the ultimate goal here. The study of animal minds, even with all its inherent uncertainty and all of these 7 challenges, isn't just asking an abstract question like, what is consciousness? At its best, it's asking a much more personal question. Who are you, the other creatures who share our world? And every tentative step we take towards a better methodology is progress toward better knowing our planetary companions.
So the next time you see one of those incredible headlines about a new discovery in animal intelligence, just pause for a moment. Think about the methodology behind it. Was the evidence holistic? How did the researchers deal with the logical problem of underdetermination? What kind of evidence would it take to truly make you confident in that claim about the mind inside that black box?
That is the ultimate question we'll leave you with today. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the infrastructure of discovery.